Greetings and blessings, YouTube. This is John the Jansenist, and this evening I'm actually going to be answering some questions sent to me by another user. I am not going to name the user in this video, but if he chooses to reveal himself in the comments section, I will leave that entirely up to him. On a previous video, I had gotten into the topic of atheism and heresy and my views regarding debating atheists in particular on the topic of religion, which I view as largely a fruitless venture, and it's not something that I do on a regular basis. I try not to do it at all, but the truth is that occasionally a discussion does come up on this subject between the two parties mentioned that can be fruitful if they're approached a certain way, and the questions that were sent to me were actually very good, and I am now going to proceed to answer them to the best of my ability, and I hope I don't leave any ambiguity on any of these. If I do, I'll be more than happy to make another video further clarifying my thoughts. Now, the first thing to establish here has to do specifically with the issue of seeing God, as it were. I made an analogy in that video discussing how seeing God required a certain instrument in order for it to be possible. Just like we cannot see atoms with our naked eye, we have to have some kind of an instrument in order to do that. I believe the instrument in question would be a catheter, a ray. This would be a way in which one could see both protons and neutrons and also electrons within the different atoms that comprise the different elements, as it were. Now, the instrument by which we would see God, and when I say see God, I don't mean in a literal sense. The actual literal word for seeing God would actually be coming to a knowledge of God, and that would be done through the instrument of faith. And so essentially the question that you have here specifically for me is that how can we come to an understanding of God, since the Bible presents God in a number of different lights? I think you refer to them as differing conceptions of God, even with terms allocated to describe his characteristics. Now, this in itself proposes a certain question regarding the nature of Scripture itself. One of the first things to understand about God is his nature. God is a holy, divine, and holy, all-encompassing being, as it were, and one that is not of matter or material, as it were, but is instead a holy spiritual being that is capable of acting omnipotently, of being omnipresent, and being all-knowing of all things. Now, the question would be, how would all of this be possible? The first thing that one would need to establish is the fact that God is fully and wholly sovereign and wholly independent, and thus also incorporeal. And thus, from this, we establish God's nature. Now, how can an unlimited being articulate truth to a limited being? This is where we get into the issue of objectivity versus subjectivity. Now, in this day and age, objectivity and subjectivity is treated differently, and this is to account for the nature of people to have differing opinions on something. But the one thing that always remains constant, even with subjective opinions, is that there is an objective fact around which the opinion is based. Now, to use Adam in the book of Genesis as an example, Adam is presented in two different states, the first being in a state of innocence and the second being a fallen state after the first sin, the transgression, eating the forbidden fruit, as it were. Now, the thing to understand is that Adam shared a relationship with God. He was in full and perfect communion with God vis-a-vis creation. That's how he was created. He was created upright. Man was created upright, and yet they sought out many innovations. That's the transition from a state of innocence to a fallen state. Now, this communion consisted of Adam's ability to understand what was expected of him, what God's views were in pertain to what he was supposed to do, as it were. And this can be treated as a subjective status. God is all-encompassing, so he is the objective. Man can only come to a limited knowledge of that objectivity, but this limited knowledge is nonetheless compatible and not in contradiction with that knowledge. Thus, we have a correct subjectivity. subjectivity and objectivity can be brought into union with each other and not necessarily be at odds with each other. Naturally, also, it is possible for a subjective opinion to defy an objective fact. People can come to a belief that a diamond is soft. Now, they might do this out of pure concupiscence, which basically means to do it just because they can, because they think it's a rebellious thing to do. But that would obviously be an incorrect assertion, and it is one that can be countered with facts. Now, the question then becomes obviously, well, how do we come to a factual knowledge of God since we can't observe him with our senses? The Bible lays out three particular ways in which God is understood. And really what that means is, how is the knowledge that he presents to us for our understanding, how is it communicable? And it's done by three ways. The first being by hypostatic union. And this is the communion and communication of knowledge when two distinct natures unite personally. Now, we only have one case of this happening, and that was the relationship of the Trinity between the Father and the Son. And the whole Trinity in itself is in a sort of hypostatic union in and of itself through spiritual union, but they are of the same nature. They are just distinct persons, so henceforth they are in union, but it is not necessarily hypostasis, but it can be comparable to that on some level. But Jesus is treated in the Bible, particularly in Matthew chapter 11 verse 27 and John chapter 17 verse 21, as being both wholly human and wholly of God, or of God's Spirit. And this is possible through a unique and specific union known as a union of hypostasis, or a hypostatic union. And this union is defined and expounded upon in the Chalcedonian Creed, and I've provided a link to the Chalcedonian Creed in the description so that you can read that. I'm not sure whether or not the church that you used to attend asserted the Chalcedonian Creed or not, but this gives some explanation of the relationship between Christ and God, and it also sheds some light onto the fact that Christ is presented as being, an all-knowing part of the Trinity, and yet at the same time he didn't seem to know everything immediately at once. And this is explained as the human nature, which is the nature that is present to us and was present to the apostles and the others who witnessed him in life, was being informed by his second nature, which he was in union with, which was the divine nature, and the divine nature was in direct communication with the rest of the Trinity, specifically the Father, the whole time. And from that you can better explain such peculiar instances such as Jesus praying in Gethsemane before he's taken away and condemned, in which he seems to be doubting his own mission and his own purpose, but when in fact what he's simply experiencing is something which all people experience, all men experience, which is doubt, and wrestling with himself over what he needs to do. Now, the second means of coming to a communicable knowledge is by intuitive or beatific vision. Now, this is something that pertains specifically to the prophets of the Old Testament, and also dealt with the visions and the supernatural and or mystical experiences of the apostles in the New Testament. And this is specifically when a vision happens that it's dreamlike in nature, in which truth is revealed by God. The entire book of Revelation, for instance, can be treated as an entirely intuitive and or beatific vision. And the third way in which this knowledge is communicable, or all knowledge, is by revelation. And this is discussed in that's John chapter 1, verse 18. Revelation consists of two subcategories. The first being natural revelation, which is a revelation which is common to all men. Anyone can come to a view of natural revelation. And it's further divided into three specific species. The first being the light of nature, and the verses on the screen right now deal specifically with this one. This is basically the light which allows our senses to perceive, so to speak. We cannot see without light, for example. The second species is the works of creation, that is, all of the material substances and entities that we see around us: rocks, dust, trees, plants, animals, other people. All of that fall under the category of creation. And the third species is the works of providence. Now, in scientific terms, this would pertain to physics, or in philosophical terms, it would be metaphysics. Basically, it is the category of all persons and entities within creation in action, as it were. Now, the second category of revelation is special revelation, and this is the revelation that is selective, and it is purely a matter of God's good pleasure. In other words, it is a knowledge that is granted in a gratuitous fashion, and it is done entirely by God's own election. Obviously, not everybody comes to religion, and obviously not everybody even within religion comes to Christianity, and so this kind of revelation is very special, and it's also very specific, and it's exclusionary also. Now, the question having to do after this, dealing with the object of orthodoxy, I'm going to get into in a separate video because I know I'm going to go long on this, but I'm going to skip ahead and I'm going to get into the questions you asked regarding specifically a rebuttal that you've heard. This is actually the Manichaean/Gnostic rebuttal, and this is a rebuttal that's actually been around since the early 2nd century, and the Manichees were a little bit later, but they were a subspecies of the Gnostic view of there being two sort of manifestations of God, or two distinct gods in the case of the Manichees, that were at odds with each other: the Old Testament God versus the New Testament God, as it were. Now, you asked, Christ had to be different from to the Gentiles, yet why was he so quick to annihilate others for believing in pagan deities? Why did he not afford his salvation to the tribes of Israel encountered in the Old Testament? Now, Scripture gets in with more detail regarding these questions, but I'm going to just deal with it in a general sense here. You later assert after that how can one claim salvation for all? The important thing to understand about where I come from and where any person asserting a biblical/Augustinian view of Christianity is coming from is that salvation is not intended for all. And this is where we get into the doctrine of election, specifically that of double predestination. I don't believe that all are intended for salvation, and I do not believe that all come to salvation. What I believe specifically is that all of mankind is in a fallen state, and they are worthy of nothing but wrath. This is a very bleak view, and this is essentially one of the reasons why Christianity is obviously not appealing to most people, because most people like to assume the best about themselves and about humanity. But the only way in which we come to salvation is that it is granted to us, and I'll assert to the verse in John chapter 6, I believe this was verse 44. No man may come to me unless it is granted of my Father. Basically what that means is that our lives, though we are not mechanistically determined automatons, we are bound to our own nature. And there is only one who can change our nature if we are to come into communion with God, to be fit to come into communion with God, as it were. And that is through a process of spiritual regeneration. The Bible makes instances. I'm going to put the specific verse on the screen for this one. The Bible gets into how we are essentially dead spiritually. We are dead in sin, as it were. And as such, we can only come to a knowledge of God if we are first reborn or regenerated. And this gets into the concept of being born again, as it were. So I'm going to separate this video into two parts, and I'm going to get into more detail on this. So until part 2, in nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, God be with you.